Hello, dear friends, and welcome to this latest episode of the podcast, The Way Out is In. I'm Jo Confino, working at the intersection of personal transformation and systems evolution.
And I'm Brother Phap Huu, a Zen Buddhist monk, a student of Zen Master Thich in the Plum Village tradition. And before we begin today's episode, I'd like to share something very special. On September 12th, Jo and I will be recording a live episode of The Way Out is in London, and we'll be joined by author and poet Ocean Vuong, who is a dear friend of mine and an admirer of our teacher Thich and the Plum Village tradition. The evening will be a deep reflection on how we can cultivate joy and togetherness in the midst of hardship, something we all need. You can find details and tickets at plumvillage.uk/live podcast, and we truly hope to see you there.
And a few days before that, on August the 26th, Brother Phap Huu and I will be releasing our second book, which is called Calm in the Storm, Zen Ways to Cultivate Stability in an Anxious World. It's a companion for these uncertain times, and we hope that it supports you and helps you to find a safe harbor in your own lives. You can pre-order it now, and it will also be available at the live event in London. We hope to see you there. So, brother, today we are going to be talking about the Plum Village tradition and deeply understanding where it comes from and how Thay has brought it back into a live, living, breathing practice.
And joining us, we have our dear friend, dear sister, Nho, who is a spiritual soulmate of mine and friend of mine. And we ordained together when I was 14 and she was 15. Nho was a nun in our tradition for 17 years, and after that, ventured into the world. And part of that, she became a scholar and did a lot of research in Buddhism, and particularly Vietnamese Buddhism, and the past of the conditions of how Vietnam was living and how it was affected by the wars, but also by the culture of Buddhism.
The way out is in.
Hello, dear friends. I am Jo Confino.
And I'm Brother Phap Huu.
And brother, one of the reasons I'm attracted to Plum Village and these teachings is because it allows me to put my life in the context of my ancestors. And this is a very powerful tradition in the East, in the sense that actually I'm not just arrived as a freshly made human being, but actually I'm the product of all my history. And I always used to remember Thay saying that when he met an individual, he never saw that person by themselves alone. He saw the entire lineage of what had brought that person to this present moment. And yet I blithely talk about the Plum Village tradition and have no idea what the Plum Village tradition is. And I suspect that many of our listeners who appreciate and practice in Thay's tradition also don't really understand where has this tradition come from, what makes it different, what makes it unique. So, Nho, it's a joy to welcome you because you are studying a PhD on this very matter. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for people to just sit and say, where does this tradition come from? But I'd like to start by asking you about how come you made the decision to follow this, to actually delve deeply into this.
This project began when Brother Phap Huu and I were attending Thay at the Hermitage. This was a bit before his stroke, and we were there and we were his attendants, and we would have these very intimate conversations in between our practices and in between sort of sessions that we were holding together. And over tea one day, Thay had asked me what I was doing at the university, what I was studying. At that time, I had just finished studying actually a degree in cognitive neuroscience. And because I sort of didn't know how to do university, I accidentally finished that degree too fast. And so I had to tack on another degree program. And it was sort of a natural, my advisors at the time said, you're kind of a Buddhist nun, so it might make sense for you to study religion. And I had never studied religion in that formal way because I was like, why? I'm a Buddhist nun. I'm just sort of living it, right? And so I told him I started studying a little bit of religion in this formal academic environment. And then he starts telling me a little bit about his experience at Columbia, at Princeton, his studies in the States. And he said, one thing that Thay never got to finish was his thesis on Vietnamese Buddhism. And he said, Gong's child, he said, Vietnam and Vietnamese Buddhism has so many beautiful things to offer and so many beautiful things to celebrate and so many beautiful things to share. But we haven't had a chance to really write about it in such a way that brings pride and brings not pride in the haughty sense, but pride is actually look at your tradition and see the beauty within your tradition and really acknowledge it and appreciate that. And then he said, will you do that for me? Will you write that thesis for me? And of course at that time I was like, yeah, sure. But I didn't know what I was getting myself into, honestly. I just made a promise. I just said, yeah, of course. Like I was, I could go and make him a bowl of instant noodles, right? And so it thrusted me down into this whole journey, in fact.
And before we get into sort of what you've discovered, how has it supported and enriched your life to delve into it?
Oof, It has been such a beautiful journey, in fact. I have learned so much more about who I am as a person, where I come from, and actually because of the invitation to go and study Vietnamese Buddhism, and in that it means I have to study Vietnamese history and Vietnamese culture, I am so deeply in love with my Vietnameseness in a way that I could have not tapped into had it not been for this invitation from Thay. And I say this honestly as, I'm a hyphenated Vietnamese, right? I am a child of refugees. I have been fed a particular story. And in fact, actually, when I ordained, Thay had asked me over tea, he said, Ga, are you Vietnamese or are you American? And at that time, I was like, American, right? I said it with my whole chest. And he goes, so you're telling me that when I ask someone to imagine someone American, they're going to see your face? And I was like, whoa. And I was but I was a kid at that time. So I was like, how dare you, right? And I said, fine, I'm Vietnamese, very reluctantly. Because at that time, I didn't have the language to even talk about or think about how I was wrestling with identity, right? I just was fed a very particular narrative as a hyphenated Vietnamese growing up in the States about who I was as a person. And so I said, fine, I'm Vietnamese. Just sort of I felt, cornered. And he goes, oh, but you don't really read and write Vietnamese, so I'm not sure if you could. And Thay knows me very well. I'm by nature a very lazy person, but I will do things out of spite. I will do and I was like, oh, are you saying I don't read and write Vietnamese? Hold your horses, because I'm about to come at you. And I went home and I was like, I studied, I was paying attention to what the brothers and sisters were singing in Vietnamese, the poems that were reciting. I started listening to their music and I started translating. I started just engrossing myself in the Vietnamese language and learning how to read and write in Vietnamese so I could just go back to Thai and be like, come at me, test me. I'll show you how Vietnamese I am, right? And we would have these conversations often about Vietnamese-ness. And Thay had such a profound love for Vietnam, such a profound love for Vietnam. And he would share that he would try to share that and instill that in me. But I was still very resistant because, again, I was fed a very particular narrative when I was growing up in the States, right? People, I remember in elementary school, they would say, you are the winner. We are being here, you're the winner here, right? And so there was a bit of shame of like the hyphenated part in me because I just wanted to be an American. I wanted to be seen in a particular, but there was something about it that I knew that it was so unattainable, and yet I still was chasing after that, right? And with Thay, he would tell these stories about Vietnam, and he would try to instill this appreciation and love for Vietnam. At that time, I didn't understand what he was doing, but I humored it, right? I humored it, and he would say things like, Gong, you and me, we're like a bamboo with 1,000 vertebrae. The winds will push us to France, to the States, but our roots are in Vietnam. That's where we are. That's who we are. And I was like, yeah, but those roots exiled you, didn't they? Right? And I had responses all the time for him. But then as I started growing, Thay just plants seeds. And, as I say, let go, let God, right? And as I started growing up and as I started maturing a little bit more in my thinking, and especially from this journey, I started understanding actually where Thay was coming from, and actually how liberating it was for me to tap into this part of me that I subconsciously was trying to reject because I felt alienated by it, or I felt like this part of me was alienating me from my American identity. But in fact, it was the only thing that no one would ever question. If I said I was Vietnamese, everyone would be like, that's right, you are, right? But if I said I was American, they were like, but where are you actually from? And so I think in many ways, the way that Thay had like slowly planted the seeds in both Brother Phap Huu and I, and the younger like hyphenated Vietnamese, was a way to like both appreciate and love on our own roots and to tap into who we are as a person and a culture and a tradition, to love and to celebrate it unapologetically, and also to critique it too. We're allowed to critique it because, is it James Baldwin? It says, if you love something so dearly, you can love it, and at the same time, you can critique it with your whole heart, right? And so I'm so lucky to have had a teacher to like be very patient with me because I'm very stubborn, be patient and continue to plant those seeds, and then allow me to fall in love with this history, with this culture, and therefore with myself.
Thank you, yeah. And Phap Huu, I want to bring you in here because this resonates to me with your journey as well, as a sort of Vietnamese American and wanting to be, as you talked about, sort of using the metaphor of banana, that you were yellow on the outside but wanted to be white on the inside. So it would be quite lovely just to hear how your journey through this, and you're reclaiming this Vietnamese culture, and also within that, I imagine this is true for so many people who are not only listening to this podcast, but around the world, who have roots which have been severed almost and have continued to grow, but not necessarily with that rooting or that sort of the love and energy of their origin flowing through them.
Just before I get into it, dear listeners, when you hear Thay, that means our teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh. And in Vietnamese, Thay is teacher. So we refer to Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh as our teacher. I think that I can add on to what Nho has shared. I think for Plum Village as a community and as a refuge, our teacher wasn't only teaching Buddhism. And I think this has to be said because he was teaching culture. He was educating us so that for those of us who have Vietnamese roots, to find a way home to our heritage. And I'm forever grateful to a Buddhist monk who felt this kind of role and responsibility, because Thay could have taken on many different personas and teachers as a Buddhist monk. But he chose to not only be a Zen teacher, a change maker, a renewer of Buddhism, but he also took on the responsibility of transmitting heritage. And part of that is Buddhism. So Plum Village, we have to remember, it started with the aspiration of being a refuge for refugees. And that's like part of the origin. And it's really important. It's a part of our history. And it goes even deeper, like you had shared from the beginning, about ancestors. And I think many people are surprised when they come to Plum Village, even in our artist retreat and our science retreat and our climate retreat and any retreat that we offer. People have expressed the surprise of how much they have to learn about ancestors in Plum Village. Because we may come to this place and we're expecting to learn about mindfulness. But mindfulness is always directed towards a deep looking, right? It's one of the wings of meditation, is to look deeply, to see through. And part of the path of the Four Noble Truths is understanding our roots. And this also comes on a very practical level, like our body, even like our ethnicity, our culture. And I think for probably a lot of us growing up in the West, who is not white, we have to tackle this crisis at one space and time in our life when we give ourselves permission, and it can be a very painful journey, because you start to recognize, like, who am I? Because like when I came to Plum Village, so we're starting to just call Plum Village Plum now. When I came to Plum, like my English was my better language. I spoke more fluently in English. But in school, they put me in ESL class, and I believe that I spoke better English than some of the white kids around my class. And there's a system of discrimination that has been, ingrained. And this, now that I've learned, is a colonial mindset of, power and status and class, So, present moment, like 2025, like this year has been very unique for me in terms of like learning to decolonize myself, because I have realized like a lot of my thinking is very Western orientated. And Plum Village has already began that journey, but I wasn't able to name it. Very simple, learning to eat my food, learning to cook my food, learning to cut the carrots the Vietnamese way. It can seem like very simple, but it has a really deep impact. And I remember like coming to Plum Village and not knowing how to speak Vietnamese there was a shame to that too. And then hearing Thay speak in Vietnamese, and I'm like, dude, I need to learn this language, because one of the surprises that I had, he became my superhero. He was like my idol, like Zen Master Thich. I was like, dude, how I want to understand this man. And to understand it, it's like, okay, I need to tap into my Vietnamese roots. And where do I begin? Well, for me, it was the monastic life. It wasn't the aspiration why I wanted to be a monk, but being an aspirant, I knew like this is something I'm going to tap into. And one of the factors of enlightenment is investigation. It's like our curiosity, like our openness, the spirit of Zen. So I started to just open my ears and to listen to all of my brothers and sisters speaking Vietnamese, and to pick up the slang, to pick up the culture, like what it means to say a word. And there's deeper meaning in particularly the Vietnamese language, because
so beautiful.
It's very beautiful. It's very rich, because one word can have three different meanings depending on the attitude, depending on the sentence, whether it is a poetic moment or it's a statement moment, and all these nuances. So exploring my roots was happening without me even knowing it.
Yeah.
And as I start to become aware of my own body, I started to tap into like, I can't run away from my ancestral roots. And it took me a very long time though, because I think the first encounter in the body was like our criticism to ourselves. Like, why am I so small? Why can't I be taller? Why can't I be bigger? And then the complexes that we have established through our childhood. And then we all have suffering, right? Growing up, whether we're from a rich family, a poor family, a refugee, like there's gonna be something that has affected us. And we're not here to judge like whose trauma is bigger and deeper. And sometimes I hear people, I've done it myself. I compare my suffering. And I feel even little like, oh my God, he suffers more. So like my suffering is not valid. And our mind is such an artist of projection and of denial of oneself. So continuing to coming home, like I can keep talking about I have arrived, I'm home, which is the first Dhamma seal of Plum Village. And it's so deep because it is about understanding our roots. But for me and Nho, she touched on, is like Thay taught all of us very differently. Like I think for me, Thay didn't ask those questions, but Thay was just like planting seeds of like, you're a Vietnamese and you need to know that. And he would give me books. Pers Buck was an author he really liked. She understood the suffering of colonialism. One story was about a Chinese man put into an arranged marriage with someone who was from China, and to see the different cultural shift and change. So like just growing up in the monastery, like Thay was not just teaching the Dharma, but also teaching us as human beings to understand it and embrace our heritage. And that's a big challenge because we all have rejection to that, But he was so patient. Like Thay was just so patient. I think we all realize that his role as a teacher is just to continuously plant seeds in us. Seeds in Buddhism is a very particular way of looking at our potentials. Like Thay would just tap into our potential and let it evolve in its own conditions. So as a young, now I can say as a young Vietnamese growing up, in Plum Village, not only was I embracing my Vietnamese roots, but at the same time, I was realizing of the fortune I have of also growing up in the West. And Thay taught us this, like we also have to embrace the fortune that we have. Like I speak English. There are cultural aspects that I can tap into the West. And then suddenly we have this responsibility of being a bridge. And I was translating a lot. Nho was translating a lot. And we helped because there were brothers and sisters that are from Vietnam who doesn't understand the Western context. And for me, one of my greatest fortune was I get to see both sides, and I was in awe of the uniqueness, the richness, but also of the suffering. I was really blown away in one encounter in the monastic world that in Plum Village I was living, and one of my elder brother, he shared in a Dhamma circle. We have just monastic days within the Rains Retreat. And when it's only monastic, like we can unapologetically just share like what's going on with us. And we don't have to put on the role of like, I'm a teacher right now, I'm a monk, I need to da-da-da-da-da, and all of the responsibility that comes with it. And this brother, like so open and said like, it's very difficult for me to be in a space with French monastics because I see them as the enemy. Their ancestors, not them, but their ancestors have killed my ancestors. So I don't want to be put in groups with French brothers and sisters. I was really young and I heard this for the first time and I was like, holy macaroni, like I would never expect a monk to say this. And I was judgmental. I was like, like we shouldn't be judging like this. But we're also taught to listen and we're taught to expand our understanding. And to today, I'm very grateful for that sharing of this brother, because I was able to see everybody's truth is very different, and how we can embrace our truth. We have limits and capacity. And many years later, I asked him, like, how are you doing with the French monastics? He's like, oh, it's so much better. I can stand in line with them now. I'm like, we got to celebrate that, we got to celebrate that. And he's still a monk today. But it's just to acknowledge that these are truths and these are our suffering that we have received as transmission. And when the journey of the way out is in, like coming into it, we have to know our limits and we have to know our capacity. But we can see the liberation that we want to touch, right? As a monastic, our greatest goal is to be in liberation, right? So acknowledging, like, maybe when you hear this, you can say like, oh, that's discrimination. But say, yes, but I'm accepting it. I'm seeing it as a suffering. So that's liberating from the suffering. To not water the seeds of it is to then tend to it, care for it, and giving yourself permission to not always touch the wound, because a wound needs time to heal so it doesn't become a deeper scar, right? So like the journey of like coming home to oneself, it's very deep. And one of the origins coming back to it is just like, as a teacher to the Western monastic, Thay would say, help heal the spiritual side of the Western society. You can have double belonging. As a Buddhist, you can deeply heal the spiritual side of your Catholic or Christian roots. Like Thay is such a teacher that goes beyond the boundary of just a Buddhist concept and world and religion. And I see that as such a gift and of a transmission.
Thank you, brother. And just picking up on that point, because it was in my mind as you were started talking about it, brother, about the value for those people in the West who are following Thay's teachings or putting Thay's teachings into their own life and practice. What is the benefit to them of understanding the Vietnamese roots of this? Because obviously you've talked about being Vietnamese living in the West, but for those who are living in the West, who are touching this tradition, what is the value for them to understand it?
I'm going to put on an academic hat really quick and just borrow some language from the academy and say it's always a good idea to be able to trace the intellectual lineage of whatever that you study, because you understand a little bit more where it comes from. And now I switch over back to it's just Nho hat, right? Like, an understanding is another name for love. And to know, in fact, what was a spirit behind the teachings, and what, when you asked me to have this conversation, you said, we just want to understand the context of Plum Village within the greater context of Vietnamese Buddhism, of global Buddhism in general, right? And so it's like the origin story. Like, where does this come from? And it's also the invitation to tap into the roots. Like, everything goes back to the roots. How do you undo suffering? You got to go to the roots. How do you love yourself more? Go to the roots, right? You go to the roots to find that stability. And I think that it's important to know where this comes from, so that you can go deep because it's an invitation to go to the roots. And if there are things that, maybe you're like, maybe there's a way we can innovate this piece here, then you know exactly how to do it and where it came from and why it had come from that place. Because there's things that you could be mad about, right? If you look at how traditions evolve, you're like, I hate that. But like one time, when I was a young nun, we had Vietnamese sisters come over, and they were very kind, and they were helping us establish ourselves as like, proper monastics. And one time I went into the restroom, and I saw at the corner of my eye an elder Vietnamese nun just kind of standing there. And I was like, she's going to say something when I cut out of this toilet. And I knew it. And I came into the restroom. I did my business, happy, lighter. I came out, and the sister goes, Sister Nho, you did not pull the panel of your back robe over your head when you came in there, and that is a violation of mindful manners. And I was like, say what? And I was like, why? And she was like, that's the rule. That's what we've been trained to do. And I was like, okay. And I just gave her a smile and a bow, as one does. And I said, not on my watch. I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to get down to the bottom of this because I need to know why we have to do this. And sometimes, I was living in the New Hamlet at that time. So you sometimes have opportunities to bring Thay his meals or, go over to the Hermitage. So I made up an excuse to go over to the Hermitage. I was like, I have to bring him his dinner. I got to go. And so I came and I brought him his dinner. And when you bring Thay dinner, you get to sit and enjoy dinner with Thay. And so I sat there and I asked Thay, I was like, Thay, this older sister, very lovely, she told me that I had to pull my back panel over my head when I used the restroom. I was like, is this something that is a part of the practice that I am unaware of? Like, how should I engage with this practice? I need to know. And he just sort of smiled and he goes, yes. He goes, a long time ago, we used to have outhouses. And the way that the outhouses work is that people just did their business and, you'd hope that, the stream of water would just push the poop down the ways. But sometimes the poop is big. And so like sometimes there would be flies that are jumping on the poop and then the flies would then jump on your head. And so you would take your back panel and cover your head so that you don't get poop on your head from the flies that are in the outhouse. He's like, and so that was necessary then, but we don't need to do it now. We have indoor plumbing. That's okay. You don't have to do that. And I was like, And that was sort of my first taste of saying there are things in our tradition and culture that we do. And if we understand where it comes from, it becomes like a beautiful story. And we can understand whether it's applicable now or not.
Thank you, Nho. So we're sort of talking a bit around the edge, but I think that's useful. So I have one more question, then we're going to really dive in. And that question is, for most people, when they think of the origin of Buddhism or Buddhist tradition, they think of Tibet, or they'll think of India, or they'll think of China. And Thay is sort of almost alone in my mind for a Vietnamese Buddhist teacher to be known in the West, or that tradition to be thought of as coming from Vietnam. And I'm just wondering if there's a particular reason that is the case. And we know, of course, that Tibetan Buddhism was partly because of the Chinese invasion of Tibet, and that sort of forced a lot of the teachers to flee and come to the West. And so we know that aspect. But I'm just wondering, is there a particular reason it's not well known?
I think the dominant narrative of Vietnam is often around war. And so when you think of Vietnam, you're like war. You think of Vietnam, you're like destruction. You think of Vietnam and you're like poverty. And I think one of the things that has come to light for me is Thay's insistence is that that's a part of our history, but that's not the totality of our history. And let me show you what. Let me show you how. Let me show you why. And I think that was one of the liberating pieces, I think, for folks who are like a hyphenated Vietnamese. Because when you do, when I was younger, as young as 6, I remember this. People, like older white men would be like, where are you from? And I would say Vietnam. And then they started telling me war stories from Da Nang. And they're like, I was in Da Nang, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, and again, that was a particular story that I was fed often. It was just like, Vietnam is equated to war. Thay said, yes, and. Yeah, we did go through a horrendous war. And let me tell you how beautiful, how rich this culture and history is. But, you're competing with dominating narratives all the time. And, post-war, people were still trying to understand what was happening. So again, the discourse about Vietnam was just about war. And Thay's insistence was like, yeah, okay, we get it. And look how beautiful this culture is. Look how beautiful this tradition is. Look how beautiful and resilient these people are. And that is worthy to be celebrated as well.
Great. So let's look into the and.
Yeah.
So what is it about the Vietnamese Buddhism that is different from maybe other origins of, or other developments of that tradition? So what makes Vietnam either unique, special, different, however we want to term that?
I would say that, and I think other Buddhist traditions would also say this, but I would say this like 10 toes down, full chest, was that Buddhism in Vietnam is deeply syncretic, meaning we get access to so much traditions just because of our particular location in the world, right? We, in Vietnamese history, we were a port city. We were we were a stop for folks along the way to China. We had engagement with like I'm trying to not be political about this, but okay, we had influences from Southeast Asia, influences from East Asia. We had influences from Malaysia, India. In fact, there are like old French scholars that would call Vietnam the Indianized state of Southeast Asia, because we had civilizations like Champa, right, that were both like in the Vedic traditions, but also Buddhist as well. And so we get from the north the Mahayana influence, and we get from the south the Theravada influences as well. And so we get to have this melange of like really beautiful practices. So at any one point in a Vietnamese Buddhist temple, you can see Zen practices, you can see Pure Land practices, you can see Theravadan practice, you can see Vajrayana practices, and they all happen. And there isn't this strong notion of like sectarianism, right? Like, I am this, I am that. And this is sort of like I would say it's a part of the Vietnamese spirit too, to like hold and integrate and be like, okay, that's cool. I like that. We could do this. And you see this often, not only in our religious traditions, but also in our foods, right? Like we perfected banh mi, right? Like pho is a part, is the history of pho is a beautiful history of pho. Like it was, came from bones that were just thrown out, and they said, actually, let us use this and see what we could see with this. And it became a beautiful, very nourishing, delicious dish, right? And so it is sort of the spirit of the Vietnamese to be like, to sort of embrace whatever is happening in that moment and to take it in as a practice as well. And Vietnamese Buddhism also has folded in it indigenous practices as well.
So give us an example.
This is a conversation I just had recently. In Vietnam, we have a practice of Đạo Mẫu, which is sort of like many scholars argue that Vietnam is not a matriarchal society, but a matrilineal society. It's like a matriarchal society light, right? There's still elements because, we had influences from China and Confucian elements that impacts the way that our culture starts to evolve. But for the most part, matrilineal, right? And there is a practice of like female divinity worship in there. And so from this indigenous practice, you have notions of what we call like Phật Ba, right? Like Lady Buddha.
And their statues.
Right?
In Vietnam.
And then you have these stories and these manifestations of like the divine feminine in the Buddhist statues, right? And so like if you look at Japan and you look at their You look at Avalokiteshvara in Japan, homie has a mustache, letting you know that it's a male like manifestation of the Bodhisattva. But if you look in Vietnam, the manifestation of Avalokiteshvara often takes a very feminine form. And I think that is a part of the matrilineal influences on Vietnamese Buddhism as it goes into of Vietnamese indigenous practices onto Vietnamese Buddhism as well.
So, given all these influences that have come together,
Yeah.
what does that mean for the practice? So rather than being Theravada, individually, you say there's this mix. What is the impact of that?
Oof. I'm gonna turn back to what Brother Phap Huu said about being able to have a foothold in two worlds, right? And I think this is the teaching that like Thay offered, especially for folks, hyphenated Vietnamese folks like Brother Phap Huu and I, who grew up both in the West and the East. You get to tap into so many sources of wisdom. And you don't have to limit yourself to one, right? I think one time Thay in a Dharma talk said, what's the benefit of being so exclusive, right? And so here I get to tap into Theravada's practice, but the thing about the Buddhist tradition in general, not just specifically the Vietnamese Buddhism, but the Buddhist tradition in general, the canon is open. That's a major technological advancement for what we consider one of the world religions, and I put this in quotes because that is a very contested term in the academy, but it's an open canon. So you get to, as a Buddhist, go at it, have at it, right? And so you get to pull from different sources of wisdom in order to create practices, mindfulness practices that address the problems that we're facing today. And, I know a lot of scholars who are like, Thich Nhat Hanh's Buddhism has no roots. It doesn't represent Vietnamese Buddhism. And this is where I get heated, right? This is where Kendrick Lamar, don't tell no lies about me and I won't tell truths about you, okay? Who are you to say what is Buddhist and what is not Buddhist? Who are you to tell a Vietnamese person, a Vietnamese Buddhist practitioner, what you're doing isn't Vietnamese enough? By what metric are you going to say, you, Vietnamese Buddhist, you, medium Vietnamese Buddhist, you, Vietnamese Buddhist light, you, not even? And so I think that we have concepts and ideas of what Buddhism should be, ought to be. It needs to be like this. And because we have these concepts and ideas, I think we're asking the wrong questions often, especially in the context of the academy, where they're always trying to say, is he Vietnamese enough? Is this representative of Vietnamese Buddhism?
So now taking that on, and Phap Huu, then I want to bring you in, is given that historical narrative, here comes Thay.
Yeah.
So picking up on that point, how has that, in a sense, tradition lineage flowed into Thay? And also a specific question within that. I remember the first interview I did with Thay for The Guardian. On the comments on the online, someone said, he's not a Zen master.
That's right.
So I'd like to sort of just, if you can just talk about how Thay fits into this lineage, how it's flowed into him and flowed through him. And if there's so many traditions, why is he a Zen master rather than another? Why has he got that moniker to his name?
Is this a Phap Huu and me question?
This is for you first, and then I'll bring in Phap Huu.
Because we come from the Dhyana lineage. Because we come from Brother Phap Huu and I are 43rd generation of the Lin Chi lineage.
So is Jo.
And Jo, we, at this table right here, everyone at this table here is 43rd lineage of the Lin Chi. So we trace back to the Zen school. right? And again, it goes back to, how dare you say he cannot call himself a Zen master? Who, like, talking about decolonialism, who made you the one who could judge what's what? If we're tracing our lineage back to this practice, the 43rd generation of the Dhyana school, of the Linji Dhyana school, the 9th generation of the Liu Guang tradition, Dharma line.
So tell us a bit about those two lines.
I think this is a Brother Phap Huu question.
Actually, I don't really, to be honest, I'm not very well versed in it, but the Linchi is a very big Zen branch that originates from China. And what we have to also, for me at least, as a student, I'm not a scholar, and I don't ever want to be a scholar.
Dang.
No, really. I know my lane, you know. Just coming back to, like, you know, all the questions of, like, why is it important to know our roots? It's because we know, like, this is not made up. And it has been transmitted from so many generations. And we are of the Linchi Dhyana school. Dhyana is meditation school. And so Linchi was a teacher that many around the nation at that time in China saw that he is a Zen master. He is a teacher. And I don't really like the word master. I think I've said this a few times in a podcast, but, you know, in Vietnamese, Thinh Sư, it means teacher of Zen, translated. But we're all teachers of Zen because we are a student of a teacher of Zen. So what we transmit is Zen. So we can have eras of defining what Zen is, but at its core, right, it's like we have two wings of a bird, which is learning to stop, which is part of meditation, learning to look deeply, to have insight. And they trace back to then the teachings of the three trainings in all Buddhist school, which is mindfulness, concentration, and insight. And it goes on, like, we are just the teachings of the Buddha. One of the beauty of it is that the monks are also scholars. They love to help articulate the teachings of Buddhism. They love to put lists and they love to categorize things as a means to transmit. And then the deepest practice is then being free from all of that and to see the weaving of all the teachings. Like we have the teachings of the Four Noble Truths, the Eight Noble Path. Like in the Plum Village teaching, Thay said, if our Dhamma doesn't have the Four Noble Truths, the Eight Noble Path, the insight of dwelling happily in the present moment focus, which also embraces the three times, the past, present, and future, that's not Plum Village Dhamma. Like we can define our teachings. And so as part of a lineage of Liu Guang Dhamma line, which just to know that it has roots where it comes from. Like I honestly, like, we don't present ourselves as like, this is our titles, this is where we're from, but it's good to know where our origins are. And then Thay goes, and Plum Village is a new tradition that has roots. Like the Plum Village Dhamma school is a manifestation from the Linchi Dhyana school and the Liu Guang Dhamma line. It's beautiful. So we have to see the school of Buddhism like a forest. And many teachers have said Buddhism is like so many schools and so many different forests that are refuge for the birds, the animals, the insects, for new plants to manifest. So we're not limited. And that's the beauty of it, right? And in the will of, our teacher written to all of us, his monks and nuns student, he said that one of the greatest heritage of Buddhism, of the Buddha's teaching, what he gave to us, is this openness to ever grow, to ever change, and not to believe in a God, a doctrine, that this is the only way, right? It has its truth, which is the noble truths. So wherever there's suffering, there has to be a response to transform that suffering. So therefore, the insight will continue to blossom and have new forms, but it all has a source of origins of love, understanding, the Four Noble Truths, the four establishment of mindfulness, coming back to our body, learning about our minds, our feelings, our emotion, about impermanence. So all of the manifestation of Buddhism has adapted to the ancestral wisdom of culture. That's why Buddhism has so many flavors. That's why Buddhism has so many different robes, so many different colors. In Vietnam is brown, then it became yellow. In China, it is yellow and orange. At some stage, it was gray at the Shaolin school. Sometimes they would have purple Sanghatis. And then in the Theravada school, it is orange, reddish, like earth color. Then goes to Korea, it becomes gray. Goes to Japan, it becomes black. For me, I love that. I love having choices. I think one of the richness is like, having options are great. But then one of the, for me though, to then, keep going on as a journey to look through spirituality, I know Plum Village is my tradition. And I'm very biased, but I open my mind to learn from other tradition. I want to hear how they expand, how the Buddhism has lasted in that country, and how have they evolved, and how is it not growing, right? It's to understand the suffering. And, I didn't know that in the scholar world, that's why I don't really tap into that. Like they were challenging Thay as a Vietnamese monk. He's not Vietnamese enough. I'm like, wow. It's but the beauty of Thay is he doesn't mind. He's people are going to have perception and people are going to judge. People are going to write about Thay. And Thay once told me this, it's we don't have time to go and correct people. Mm-hmm. We have time to develop our liberation and transmit this beautiful teaching to the next generation. And Thay's role, though, as a monk and as a teacher, was to make Buddhism alive again. And that was a very important thread that he transmitted to the Plum Village tradition. That's where engaged Buddhism came from. And then it was in 2012, if I remember, Sister True Dedication will know more, because Thay was communicating a lot to her about language and literature of Thay's redefining of our tradition. And then, because people were so caught in the word of engagement, because they thought that to be engaged, you have to just be a social worker. But Thay's no, you have to be engaged in the world, but then you have to apply the practice to your engagement. So then at one point, Thay reframed it, Thay renamed it Applied Buddhism. And for me and us now, we're it's engaged Buddhism with a +1 and it's applied, And like I say, language is just language. We don't want to be away from the essence of daily adaptation of the practice. That is the most key and important aspect. And to come back to, what we're discussing, and then maybe we should go into some history facts, because it'd be fun. But when I was with Thay was Thay knows his roots. He once said Thay is very progressive in order for the tree to grow, but Thay is very conservative to restore the roots. He said that's the dance we always have to move around. And in the teaching of the Buddha, the middle way, we have to find a pathway that continues to evolve to meet the present moment. But then we have a root, which when we say root teacher is the Buddha. Our root teacher is the Buddha. But then we know that the Buddha's insight didn't just manifested from Buddhism. It was from his upbringing, from Hinduism, and all the different traditions that he encountered too. So Thay has said Buddhism is made of non-Buddhist element. Plum Village is made of non-Plum Village element. But it does have foundations. And we have the 4 Plum Village seals that Thay has said these are the defining of our way of teaching and of practice. But he never said, and this is it. Maybe as we continue to grow, we can see new seals in our Dharma line. But Thay is always, he's not about like just renewing. He's actually about restoring. He's about bringing back Buddhism so that it can be adaptive, applying, and it's transformed. Because Thay said, if Buddhism is just about writings and about papers and about it's about a combat of like who's right and who's wrong, like we defeat Buddhism. Buddhism is a way of being. It's a way of life. It's a way to engage into the world. It's how we cultivate all of these teachings in order to enhance our deep technology, which is being together as human beings at one level, and then at a deeper level to the cosmos, to the trees, to how we innovate, right? It's like, that's where Thay was like, let me teach the tech to bring in spirituality. Let me teach the business world to bring in spirituality. Let me teach political people in power there to have a deeper understanding of compassion, So Buddhism is not limited at just in quotes, religion. It is much more deep, because the Buddha's question is like, how do I liberate all of us from suffering? And that is a deep vow.
So, Nho, just coming back to you, and just coming back a little bit in the conversation. So Phap Huu is wonderful because he's not a scholar, and you are wonderful because you are a scholar. So just bring us back a little bit to those lineages coming into the Plum Village tradition, just to give people a sort of sense of that journey. And then let's talk about sort of the Plum Village tradition.
Yeah. I think it's important to really unpack the things that Brother Phap Huu said, because he said a lot of really rich things. He's talking from Brother Phap Huu era, and this is the beauty of our friendship. He just spits truths, and I'm like, and let me tell you why you're right? Not in an unbiased way because I love him and I think he's amazing, but because this is what I'm seeing as I'm doing my research. I think what Brother Phap Huu is sort of pointing us to, and I want to follow this direction where he's going to, is that he presents this sort of meta-narrative of the Buddhist Institute overall, right? We're talking about, why is it that Buddhism, again, as a religion, I'm going to put this in quotes, why as Buddhism as a religion enters spaces like China and becomes Chinese Buddhism. It enters spaces like Vietnam, becomes Vietnamese Buddhism. Then Korean Buddhism, Thai Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, American Buddhism, right? Wherever it goes, it then becomes a hyphenated Buddhism. And there's no one unifying identity of Buddhism, right? That is a technology that as Buddhist practitioners, we get to tap on into, and nobody questions this. But once someone sort of taps into that technology in our present day, you say, that's not Buddhism, right? Because there's critique. They say that, no, Nho Tran, that's not Buddhism. And I was like, how dare you? How dare you exclude, like, this Buddhist monk who's this inheritor of these Buddhist traditions, making use of these Buddhist technologies, and you come in and you say, because they do not fit your narrative, your assumptions of what Buddhism and Vietnamese Buddhism more specifically looks like, you try to take it away from him. And again, ask better questions, right? And so I think that in itself is a testament to how Plum Village traces its lineage in the ways that its practices have evolved to Buddhist traditions in general. And I don't think at all that Plum Village and the Plum Village practice and Thay's practice that he's given to us, I don't really think that it is any sort of doctrinal deviation. Like, there's no creation here. And I've never in my whole monastic life and of studying all the Dharma talks and reading all of his books, I've never heard Thay say, and this is my invention. This comes from me. He always cited his sources. And as a Buddhist monk, his sources so happen to be Buddhist sutras. And so I don't think that it is, I'll double down this. Plum Village is not this sort of like creation or deviation from a a traditional Buddhist tradition. Because again, what does that even mean? Right? Let's get down to the ground. What is that when you say a traditional Buddhist tradition? What does that mean? Is it your ideas of what Buddhism is, or what Buddhism is actually on the ground? I think the thing that people are irked about is that he's found new ways to express Buddhism that doesn't meet people's standards, assumptions, and perceptions of what Buddhism should look like. And so for me, it's like Brother Phap Huu said, it's like, in Buddhism, we even have the concept of expedient means, of skillful means. And so that in itself is embedded in the Buddhist institution to be able to speak to the language of your times, right? We have the deviations of the Theravada school and the Mahayana school, and nobody questions that. They're like, yeah, that's a given. And so why is it when at this moment we say, look at these wisdom traditions, how do we share it in such a way where people could actually apply it to their lives and benefit from it? Let us think about this together. People saying, that's not Buddhism. Buddhism is, supernatural, especially in the Vietnamese tradition. I mean, that's one of the critiques. And I was like, Thay never took away or stripped away the supernatural. In fact, he gave you new language to engage with the wonders and the beauties of this world, and gave you new ways to engage with the supernatural. But because you have a very particular idea of what the supernatural looks like, you don't want to hear it. You can't tap into that because the ability to be open to this sort of discourse isn't there. Again, the Buddhist canon is open. Think about that. That is such, because then it means everybody gets to contribute. This is a collective effort. You get to have Jo Buddhism. Brother Phap Huu gets to have Brother Phap Huu Buddhism. I get to have Nho Buddhism. And we get to check ourselves too. Because again, there's ways in which you could abuse the tradition. And that's why community is so important. Because you're like, dang, Jo, I don't know if that's right. Or you're like, dang, y'all, the way that you understood that, I feel like you might be treading in dangerous waters there. We get to check ourselves, right? And Brother Phap Huu and I, we always joke, we're like, businesses should consult us because, if you're talking about institutional longevity, we're here. This is one of the longest living institutions of the world. And to sort of understand the underbelly and the technologies that has allowed it to continue in this way, in this form, is both beautiful and empowering too. Because then you get to see, you study the past and you study the roots and see how our teachers have done it before and how they've brought to life these practices over and over and over again, right? And oftentimes people would say people in Vietnam a long time ago, I think less so now, but people would say things like, Thay's so disconnected from Vietnamese Buddhism. And again, my question is, what is your assumption about Vietnamese Buddhism? How are you pigeonholing, this culture and this tradition? And actually, instead of allowing it to be the expansive expression it is, to just really deducing it to something that you can measure.
So, thank you for that. And let's go into Thay's brilliance. So, my question to both of you is, given this rich history, and Brother Phap Huu, you talked about Thay restored, reconnected to the roots of this tradition, and he's renewed it and given it a new way of being present in the world that's relevant to people. So what is it about Thay that was able to knit those two together, the past into the present into the future?
I think one of just before we get, to deeper to your question, but I would say one of the uniqueness I feel of Thay as a teacher, as a Buddhist teacher, was his openness. That when you come to this retreat, I don't ask you, Jo, are you Buddhist? that, my friend, is the gates are open. You don't need to be a Buddhist to receive teachings from me. You don't need to be a Buddhist to be a part of the Sangha here, to be part of a ceremony, to be welcome at the table. That for me was very unique. And not only that Thay has made the teachings so transparent in a way that it can address almost like our world crisis right now. Like the teachings, like he's able to be so free from Buddhism that he can strip away the Buddhist language when it is needed. And that is one of the powers of Thich. He's not caught in Buddhism. There's this interview that is I love, like there's this little clip, and I hope it goes viral. But this interviewer asked Thay, is like, Thay, you say that somebody asked you, Thay, if you're to choose peace or Buddhism, and you said, I'll choose peace. And he said, that really like made me wonder so much, because I've never heard a world religious teacher say that he will let go of Buddhism. And Thay just laughed and he said, it's very simple. And then the interviewer also just laughed. And Thay said, well, because if we have peace, that is Buddhism. And if we are practicing Buddhism, but we're not practicing inner peace, outer peace, and liberation, then that is not Buddhism. So it's like Thay's understanding of Buddhism is so beyond form. And I think that is the insight that not only is a view, but he has implemented it into his way of being. And that has been like the energy of how he shifted and created Plum Village and the monastic community. When Thay created the monastic community, it wasn't as simple as just having his own continuation, but it is he also wants to restore the monastic order in the world, so that the monastic community as religion has also burned a part of people's trust and faith in a spiritual dimension. And we're not ignorant to this. We're aware of this. But that doesn't mean we have to get rid of religion and we have to get rid of spirituality. That's a very extremist view. It's like when something is bad, destroy it. But here it's like, Thay is like, no, but there's so much richness and goodness in spirituality and in religion, because religion is made of non-religious element. There's a lot of wisdom there. It is continuing, like especially Buddhism, it is a manifestation of insight from suffering. So why not learn from it? Why not return to its source to enhance our understanding of our times, right? And part of Thay's teaching to the monks and nuns is that a new order, so that there is a Dharma line that is unbroken. And this for me is really important as a monk. I take that on as a responsibility. Like when the Buddha became enlightened and talked about, gave his first Dharma talk about the Four Noble Truths, the Eight Noble Paths, people said like that's when the Dharma wheel was moved again, right? It's a very beautiful saying. It's not when the Dharma wheel was started, because even the Buddha is a continuation of many teachers. And some have, I've heard this, and some said when Thay have brought mindfulness and become a teacher that is a refuge for many, it's like the Dharma wheel moves again. So it's like the transmission of the lineage of Buddhism, and I'm not talking about the lineage of Plum Village, the lineage of Buddhism continues to flow into the world. And Thay has already instructed us, like Thay expect at one day and age, like our form as a Plum Village monk will change also. Like he said, our robes, or the color of the robes. But he said this very beautifully. But when you go back to Vietnam though, you can wear the brown robes and the traditional straw hats, because that is our roots from Vietnam. So it's like never to lose that root. But if, let's say, in my lifetime or in the next generation's lifetime, maybe what they will be wearing is not what I'm wearing today. And that is appropriate, because It is the evolution of an organism, of a body, of a religious, alive spiritual dimension. So like who Thay is and who the spirit of what Thay has brought in, Thay marries so many traditions in the Plum Village tradition. Thay said, oh, you want Pure Land Buddhism? Here it is. But the Pure Land is here and now. Right? You can touch it here and now. Don't wait until you die to go into the Pure Land, because if you can't touch it while you're alive, I'm not sure you can arrive there when you die. And it's like traditional chanting, we got it here too. But okay, today we are bringing in also the Western manifestation, bring in the cello, bring in the violin, bring in the flute, bring in the instruments that was created from the ancestors of these lands. And when we have indigenous leaders come, teach us about your traditions. Some of it, we can apply it to the traditions that we have. So it is this like amazing foundation where flowers of different traditions can also take root and blossom here. But, and we do have the right to, when something is so off and something's like, oh no, that's not part of our tradition. But we honor it, we celebrate it, and you can do it over there though. You know, and I think it's important to define all of this. And it's when we learn about the Vinaya, which is like the laws of the monks and nuns, there's this thing as flexibility. We have to be open. But there are moments we have to be very rigid, because these are our boundaries as a monk and a nun. If we do this, we're not monk and nuns. So like there's this like dance between, and that's why I say it's hard to be a Buddhist, because it's like there's so much like list of things that we get to learn. But then the Zen master will say, and be open. But what is our compass? That is mindfulness. Comes back to our awareness of the present moment.
Wow, brother, you're a poet. That was so beautifully spoken and so deeply heard. Yeah. Build on that if you can.
I could always riff off of my brother here. I mean, this is the beauty of the conversations that we have, because I think that we often think of, like, what are our responsibilities? And I'm going to shout out to Vietnamese Buddhism. One of the things that is so profoundly beautiful about Vietnamese Buddhism is the harmony between the lay sangha and the monastic sangha. I get to have these conversations with Brother Phap Huu because of this deep integration of the lay community in the Buddhist life. And historically, and in fact, when there was like the Buddhist revival movement in the 1920s, that was spearheaded by lay friends. And they were like, if you can do it, we're going to do this stuff for you. And so this is deeply embedded in the Plum Village community, right? In the Plum Village practices, to not just, there's no hierarchical thing. So we keep each other accountable to the work that we're trying to do and the peace that we're trying to bring to this world. And so I think that Brother Phap Huu, to riff off of the things that Brother Phap Huu is saying, to build up on that, I think that he's right. There is this, it's like silk, right? There's moments where you have to be very fluid and soft, and there's moments where you're very firm about what our ethical obligations are. And when Thay says, I'm restoring, I'm renewing, he's breathing life into this practice so that it becomes accessible to people. The name of the game is liberation. And how do we get people there? And so if we are so caught in the form, so caught in the language, so caught in the label of I am a Buddhist and this is what I must do, we run into trouble. And so Thay is always like saying, inviting us to ask, what's the spirit behind this? What are we trying to achieve together, right? And so when Brother Phap Huu talks about mindfulness, and that's it, right? And so how do you, as a tradition that is invested in our collective liberation, how do we get there together? And it's kind of like thinking about pedagogy, right? We are finding better ways to teach math to children. And why can't we think about that in the same way as a Dharma? we're thinking about better ways to communicate and make this practice accessible, not because of some sort of hegemonic power that we're trying to impose on everyone. It's just like, look, we have something that's very beautiful and we'd love to offer it to you. Take it or leave it, right? And it's open. You don't have to abandon yourself. You don't have to abandon your spiritual roots and who you are as a person to engage in this. It is a mere tool and practice for you to actually tap into who you are as a person so that you could love yourself more, so that there's more loving energy in this world, right? We have people who can love better, more deeply in this world through this practice. And so, yeah, it's like this. I love the story. And I love that clip of Thay because it was so light and funny when he just says, he goes, what's so hard to understand, right? If Buddhism becomes if the identity or the moniker of Buddhist gets in the way of the work that I'm trying to do, which is peace and liberation, I will let that go gladly. But it doesn't mean I'm not a Buddhist, or it doesn't mean that I don't get to tap into the tradition. It's just because if that's getting in the way, if that's making people suffer more, that's not the name of the game. I'm trying to get to liberation. I'm trying to get to freedom for everyone. I'm trying to get to a place where everyone gets to tap into this endless source of love.
And not just checking, because even in the Plum Village tradition, there are people who don't want to see change.
Sure.
And there are people who want to see change.
Sure.
So historically, Buddhism has splintered into different schools.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, what's your sense of how to manage, and Phap Huu, this is also to come to you, but how do you manage that sense of some people see the openness as a doorway to walk through, and some see the openness as a door to shut? And it's really fascinating because, of course, this comes back to our personal way of seeing the world. Some people get very fearful of change, that they want that the traditions, the old ways, they see as anchoring them, and new ways they see as losing something. So I'm just really interested in that dynamic historically and today.
Yeah. This is a fun topic for me because I was Buddhist nun first, and then I don't like using the word scholar, but okay, fine, scholar, with a grain of salt, a scholar afterwards. And so sometimes when I read people's historical analysis of like what happened in the Buddhist community, I kind of sort of laugh a little bit. I was like, you guys are so dramatic. You want drama all the time, right? But to me, they call the sort of split between like what we call nowadays the Theravadins and the Mahayanists, they call it a schism, right? Meaning there was a disharmony in the community and therefore it split. But as a person who lives in the community and has grown up in the community, I'm like, people get old. People get tired. And some older monks and nuns are like, I'm good. I'm going to hang out back here in the monastery. Y'all go doing the work in society, and that's cool. Right? Support and celebrate. And so there's space for everybody, right? There's space and there's room for, look, again, what's the benefit of being exclusive? And so in my mind, as I'm thinking as a monastic who has lived in the community and see that this is truly a human community. It's not this, I don't know, people love to exotify, first of all, the monastic life and to not allow monastics to be human. And then also, they love a dramatic story. In my mind, when I'm reading about the sort of evolution of the Mahayanist tradition, I'm watching it happen here in Plum Village. We have our elders whose forte is maintaining and holding on to the lineage and telling us what the practices were many years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And their energy is not at the level of energy of maybe like the younger monastics who are out here are like, and then we're going to have the science retreat, and then we're going to have the artist retreat, and then we're going to have all these retreats, right? And I think there's a beauty to that where we got our elders who are like, great, go on, go forth and do the things that you do. If you need us, we're here, we're supporting, celebrating. Our energy isn't there anymore. And then you have the younger monastics be able to do it. And I think it'll cycle again because it's fluid and there's dynamics. That's the dynamics of the community and like of one's life, right? At one point, like Brother Phap Huu and I were talking about this yesterday. Like when Thay was a little bit younger, he would give 2 Dharma talks a day. Early morning Dharma talk, breakfast, another Dharma talk. I mean, it was just, he was, and 2-hour, these weren't like 30 minutes, they were 2-hour Dharma talks, and he would cycle through languages. And he was going in, right? After a while, he was like, okay, 1 Dharma talk. Right? 1 Dharma talk. I'm good. That's where my energy allows me to go. And so I think we have to humanize the stories that we I think give grace to the stories that we have of each other, of the community, of the evolution of the Buddhist community in all of its manifestations.
Beautiful, thank you. Phap Huu. And just to I mean, you'll say what you want to say anyway, but
I will say what I want to say. That's true.
I know, but just to that flavor, because Plum Village is a young tradition.
Yeah.
And you get all this youthful energy that you're getting, you know, at the moment you've got 10 aspirants, they're very young. They'll bring all their, and they're mostly, I think, mostly Western, they're bringing different energies to it. I'm just wondering also, apart from what you were going to say anyway, how you hold that space so that everyone can show up, but they're going in the same direction. That's a job.
I would say we're a young community, but with very ancient roots, though. And I've been feeling this more and more. And as I reflected, even my times with Thay, we're always renewing. And there's always something new in a few years. Like Thay opens the Wake Up project, which is bringing mindfulness into education. But there's always an ancient root. It never differs away from that. And we have been trained in that. So everything we do, like a retreat for artists, it's not the first time. Thay actually did it many, many, many years ago in the 70s, and that's where the song Please Call Me By My True Name was put into music. And then later in the early 2000s, Thay did one in Hollywood. And then only in 2025 we kind of like we realized that if we want a collective awakening, which is Thay's insight, that's the antidote for our times, we need to bring in the culture shifter, and that is art of all forms, right? And when we did this retreat, like even in the monastics world, they're like, oh, like, what are we gonna do? I'm like, what do you mean? We're gonna do sitting meditation in the morning for 30 minutes. We're gonna eat in silence. We're going to listen to a Dhamma talk. We're gonna do walking meditation. We're gonna do total relaxation. We're gonna have Dhamma sharing. We're going to have sitting. We're gonna have chanting. Everything we do on a daily basis, right? And I remember I shared the schedule to a dear sister who's like in another hamlet who was curious, like, what are we doing for the artist retreat? Is it different? And she looked at the schedule and she was like, brother, it's the same thing. I'm like, the spiritual technology works. Like our root is there. The only difference is maybe the stories that we're bringing in, what we've heard of the suffering of the artist. And our approach, our energies that we bring, because we're tapping into the energy of all of the artists that are in the community. That is where the applying, the engaging, the refreshment of it. And I was very flexible in the schedule of this retreat. The artists had different needs, and we're just, okay, let's put this schedule aside, even though we prepared it, and let's create something new that can meet the moment of the artist, right? And that is renewing, but of an ancient root. And I've reflected a lot on Plum Village's evolution. The truth is, today with over 12 centers that we have in 4 different continents, we have the same thread of the tradition, but we are already different in some laws and regulations. For example, in Plum Village, France, we do the 5-year program, which Thay set up here to have young friends from the age of 18 to 35 can be a monastic just for 5 years and they can leave. Because this was to meet the fear of this generation, of this time, and the people growing up in the West. But then in Thailand, our center there, don't have this program because they have more than enough monastics. And they adapted to the Theravada community and the Thai culture. They would do 1 week monastic ordination or 1 month. And in the EIB, they just did a 1 week ordination retreat. You can become a monk just for 1 week. And Plum Village, we have never done this. Will we do it? We don't know. But you see, like, there is already the adaptation to meeting the demand, the needs. And I expect our times in the Plum Village tradition to also evolve into different forests, but all respecting and honoring that we are part of the same lineage. That for me, I see the beauty. I'm already envisioning it. And conservativeness is wonderful, but it's also being safe, because what has worked, let's just keep it there. And there are those who that's all they need. And maybe they will touch enlightenment before us, before those who are like, let's see what's new, like what's up in the world. Like I wanna know about it. And like I just feel like in our community, there are brothers who I have so much respect for. They're quiet, they're less bothered, they are so solid. I'm not like that. I want to know. I'm curious, and sometimes I disturb myself, and then I need weeks to then be concentrated again. But everybody has their path. But the forest gives us so many paths and so many shades. And I once had this conversation with one of our senior elder brother, and I asked him, like, do you think we're gonna change? And he said, absolutely, brother. That is the only way we're gonna survive. Is one day Plum Village is gonna branch into many different branches. And he when I heard him say this, it was almost liberating. He said, and isn't that beautiful? Because he's a historian, this elder brother. He said, that's how Buddhism has survived to now, is because of the branching out of Buddhism, of the permission to evolve into different traditions. So I'm already practicing to not be attached to the Plum Village tradition, meaning what I see now. And what I see now is already different from 23 years ago when I started. It's very different already. And nothing is lost though. Like there is still those moments of how I started is still here. And there are some of the things that are new, but was already there, but didn't have the opportunity yet to manifest. And it's true. I'm not trying to be a poet or anything. I something that we did, I was like, wow, that is the seed that either it was a Thay who planted it, or it was a monastic that said, one day, wouldn't it be wonderful, ... Right? So for me, I already see the change that is here, the change that will be, and also the root that will still be present. For me, like, that is very important, being rooted. And I kind of feel like in our times, it's more needed, the rootedness. Because like our times, it's like, what's new? What's the new fix? What's the new change? And then everybody's just almost like, spiritual hopping in a way, traditional hopping, or even learning hopping. Like, but I'm still practicing breathing, Jo. I'm still learning to just like, this is anger right here. But my insight of how to be with anger is evolving, is growing, is changing. I'm like, when my anger is present, hello, my anger, you are there. And you are powerful. And you give me insight to see what is pain, what is injustice. And wow, from anger it brings compassion, brings loving kindness. And it allows me to meet the injustice with a kinder eye, so that I don't turn this other human being into an enemy, but I see what I want, what I'm facing with is ignorance, is wrong views, is discrimination. And that's this origin of the teaching of the Buddha. and I expect, like all of us in this tradition, if one day, we have another, it's not Plum Village, it is Pine Gates or something like that, like we celebrate it. And I think this is a practice that, like, when looking at our traditions, like I say it with an S now because it's not singular. It's we brought in, even in our lineage, we have 2 lineage already. You are of the Linchi and the Liu Guang Dharma line. And in the future, like my students will be, you are of the Linchi, the Liu Guang, and the Plum Village tradition. And it's really cool to I'm really proud. I'm like, I can say like I'm part of the first generation of the Plum Village tradition. And there's something when we hear tradition, it's not about conservativeness, it's a root, it's a transmission that you're receiving of a wisdom that has been developed, transmitted, practiced, renewed, practice again, renewed. It's very scientific in traditions.
Brother, thank you. And just, no, you want to add
I-
something? Of course you can.
Of course, because Brother Phap Huu always says things, and I'm like, let me
build on this.
Let me build on this, because I think that where he's taking us is a very important place, because it speaks a lot to, I think, our tradition, and also an experience that I had with Thay. And it goes back to when Brother Phap Huu and I were his attendant, or attending Thay at the Hermitage before he had the massive stroke. And there was moments, again, in between treatments and just our sessions together that we would be doing things. And there was this one particular day where I had given him a treatment, and he had a burst of energy. And he gets up and he goes, let's translate again the heart of the Prajnaparamita Gong. And I'm like, that's what you want to do with this burst of energy that you have? And every time he had a little bit of energy, he's like, let's work on this translation together, Gong. And so we would transition from treatment into translating this heart of the Prajnaparamita. And for those who don't know, the heart of the Prajnaparamita is the heart of perfect understanding, and is a seminal text in the Plum Village tradition. If any sutra was going to be chanted, it's probably that sutra in a big ceremony. And I was sort of like, what is his obsession with this sutra, right? And I humored it. I was like, okay, let's do it. And so we would go deep into the linguistics of each word, and we'll look at the Sanskrit, and then we'll look at the Chinese, and we would sort of it took us weeks to sort of get to a translation that he was really like satisfied with. And then he said, send this off so that we can have a new chant for this. And I've been sitting on that, and I sort of was thinking about this because I was like, why in the moments where he had energy, this is the thing that he was going to really invest his time and energy in, because there's other things that he could be doing. And as I started growing and a little bit like maturing and listening to more Dharma talks of Thay, I started, and listening right now to Brother Phap Huu, it dawns on me, right? Like the heart of the Prajnaparamita at its crux, at its essence, essentially says, the perfection of wisdom is to be able to hold 2 seemingly contradicting things together in perfect harmony, right? Put that into conversations with the foundational texts of Plum Village, such as the 4 establishments of mindfulness, the Anapanasati Sutra, the Sutra on mindful breathing, and what do you get? You get, first of all, Plum Village, the spirit of Plum Village teaching, which is at once we are holders of a great ancient tradition, and we are shakers in the world, right? We get to tap into the ancient wisdom, but we also get to meet the world where it is at the same time. And you are on the way of asking me, who is Thay? I think this is him. Right? He holds the tradition, but he's not afraid to branch out, just as Brother Phap Huu said. That's one thing. The other piece is like the heart of the Prajnaparamita gives us this, allows us to both be a contemplative on the cushion and a responder to the world at the same time. We get to both be in our practice in engaging in the world. That too is a spiritual practice, because we love to have these dichotomies. We love to say this is good and this is bad. And Thay saying, yes, and, yes, and. Yes, you can be a meditator and you can be a social activist. Those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. And so you get to, so he is like, the question is like, why do we chant the heart of the Prajnaparamita all the time? That's Thay saying, yes, and we have this deep tradition and we get to not be afraid of change. We get to help it evolve. We get to tap into it when we need, and we get to expand it when it's necessary.
So this is a good moment to stop and to thank you both. And thank you so much for this time and also our previous episode. And we look forward to inviting you again. And thank you both, because actually for me personally, I haven't heard this conversation before. I haven't really put a lot of thought into it. So it's lovely, and I'm sure for our listeners, just to have that rootedness themselves. That it's not just the practices in the present moment, it's the practices that have been matured and rethought and rethought, and that they are, in this moment, a new branch. Mm-hmm. And as you said, no separation between the lay and the monastic tradition, that actually, we're all new branches on this tree that's ever growing. So thank you both so much. So, dear listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, and I can't believe you didn't, then you can find many more, and you can find us on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, on any platform that carries podcasts, and also on our very own Plum Village app.
And you can also subscribe to The Way Out is In podcast on the platform of your choice, and also to leave a review if you feel inspired to help others discover the podcast. And you can also find other previous guided meditation, because we didn't have time to do one today, in the on-the-go section of the Plum Village app. And this podcast is co-produced with Global Optimism and the Plum Village app with the support from the Thich Hanh Foundation. If you feel inspired to support the podcast moving forward, as well as the monastery, please visit www.tnhf.org/donate. And we want to thank our friends and collaborators, Clay, our dear friend, aka the Podfather and co-producer, Kata, our co-producer, our other friend Jo, who is doing auto editing today, Georgine, who is on sound and engineering, Anka, our show notes and publishing, Jasmine and Cindy, our social media guardian angels, and to all of you who listen and supports us. Thank you, and see you next time.
The way out is in.